Everyone, thanks for clicking on my video. This week, Octavio Paz. If you're looking to read about Mexico and understand its history and culture, Octavio Paz is a figure that has to be dealt with. He's something of a touchstone because of his stature and the art and cultural history of Mexico, because he won the Nobel Prize in Literature and is the only Mexican to do that, and because of the sheer genius of his art and the insight of his work. All of these things combine to make Octavio Paz a figure you really have to consider if you're going to think seriously about this country and its beautiful past and culture. So I read an excerpt on Paz from this book, The Mexican Reader. Great book. It was only 4 or 5 pages long, and it left me wanting much more. So for the first time in my readings, I actually purchased the original source material, The Labyrinth of Solitude. And this is a little different for Paz. It's a collection of essays. It's not poetry. Most of his works were poetry. And so I'm grateful that it's essays but I came away with 7 takeaways after reading this book and reading about Paz online. And let's get started with our countdown. Number 7. Paz might look like Mr. Rogers, but on the inside, somehow if you were to combine a love child between this guy and maybe her too, Paz is definitely one book that you should not judge by his cover. Throughout his life, Paz would strive for piercing insight, relentless creativity, and unapologetic honesty. And this is true not only in his artistic life, but also in his personal and his political life. He stretched his poetic and literary efforts using new, novel formats to present content that had never been seriously addressed before. It had kind of been relished to the realm of the adult or risque. And even in his political life, it seems that Paz went to great efforts to make sure his thoughts were his thoughts. No one else was going to do his thinking for him. He rolled up his intellectual sleeves and did the hard work himself. So the next thing, number 6 on our countdown of things you need to know about Octavio Paz's Labyrinth of Solitude. The book is highly quotable. It is packed with great little snippets and sometimes longer, more insightful quotes that bring you back kind of again and again. And so what makes a great quote? I think sometimes they can be vague, or sometimes they're provocative. But in Paz's case, it's usually when there are multiple layers of meaning and things seem to be a contradiction. Maybe they are a contradiction, and let's take a look at a few of these quotes. The first one, I focused on finding something that was a little bit vague, and it kept drawing me back because of that. What did he mean by this? It was a part of a kind of general part of a chapter, not making a hugely specific point, and he's discussing the difference between Mexicans and, as he calls them, us, me, North Americans. He says, "We, meaning Mexicans, get drunk to confess. They, North Americans, get drunk to forget." I don't know what that means, but I think about it. For a quote that might be considered a little provocative, I found this one. There is a Mexican mystery, just as there is a yellow mystery and a black. Okay. But again, for me, Paz's best quotes are the ones that tinker with the notion of duality. Something both means and doesn't mean something, or it means one thing and it means the opposite at the same time. The cult of life, if it is truly profound and total, is also the cult of death, because the two are inseparable. And the next thing, number 5 on our countdown, is it's not really meant to be a criticism, but it kind of sounds like one. The book comes off a little dated. Now, this is not a history book per se, even though it blends in multiple disciplines of history and philosophy and poetry and all these really beautiful tools that Paz uses to drive home his larger argument. The book is about cultural anthropology and the psyche and the character of the Mexican people. And it was written in 1950 first, and it was heavily edited, I believe, in 1959. So that's a ways back. You're coming on 3/4 of a century. And there are times when you're reading the book, you feel like you picked up a magazine from 1958. The first chapter in particular deals with something called Pachuca culture, which is a group of delinquents that seem to have been prevalent in Southern California in the 1950s. And if you look up these guys, it looks like something out of a Batman flick. They're dressed in these zoot suits, and And I've never heard of this. And what are you talking about? Who are these people? So beyond the Pachuca exception, there's just a sense that if Paz were writing this now, things in Mexico, I sense, have changed from when Paz wrote this in a profound way. And maybe the labyrinth wouldn't be quite so vast, and the solitude maybe not quite so severe. So, number 4 on our countdown is this book is perfectly entitled. The Labyrinth of Solitude is the perfect title for the argument that Paz is making. Every chapter is an essay that could kind of stand independently, but every essay is like a corridor, a callejón, and this labyrinth that weaves around, and each of these essays end to the same place, that the core and the essence of Mexican identity is wrapped up in this willful quest for solitude, a cutting off from the other. Okay, we're getting down to the nitty gritty, to the meat on the bone. Number 3 on our countdown, the Cortesian conquest is absolutely essential to Paz's view of Mexican character and this labyrinth of solitude. Paz says, the conquest of Mexico would be inexplicable without the treachery of the gods. Only they had the power to choose, and therefore, in a profound sense, to sin. The conquest would transform native society. The gods of war and of victory abandoned their people, and these masculine deities were emasculated. In their stead, over the colonial era, feminine icons began to ascend to the apex of the communal myth structure. The Virgin of Guadalupe, La Llorona, and most importantly, La Malinche, who we'll get back to in just a minute. So the conquest lays at the very basis of this quest for solitude. The idea that masculinity asserts itself by cutting itself off from the others. Okay, number 2 on our countdown. Paz's chapter on La Malinche and the phrase, Viva Mexico, hijos de la chingada. Now, please excuse me if you have a young one in the room that speaks Spanish, because this can be and often is a vulgarity. And that is how Paz intends it. But Paz takes this phrase and he breaks it down, and he looks at the elements of Mexican society that are revealed within this notion. There are elements of language and history and iconography that combine to shape layers and layers of Mexican culture. It is a really beautiful chapter. I think I'm going to do a whole video on just this one phrase and what Paz sees about this phrase that gives such powerful insights into his arguments. And finally, to wrap up our countdown, number 1, when you're reading Paz, when you're reading Labyrinth of Solitude, appreciate that you're reading someone who's probably a genius, and not just a literary genius. Paz commands his subject matter with a mind that is multi-layered, multi-tiered, has several dimensions that most of us, or at least I, don't possess. One sentence, he's a poet, then he's a philosopher, then an anthropologist, then a historian. One critic says that Paz wrote deliberately on the edge of genres. Another one said his work is both an essay and a poem, or neither, or both. The effect of this is almost like a very, very rich literary cheesecake where there's so much going on. It's overwhelming. You kind of feel full, but it's so good that you have to finish it. Let me know what you think about the videos, and we'll see you the next go around. Keep reading.